read 36 books in 2023, and I thought I'd pick my favorite one by pitting them all against each other. First up, we have The Unhoneymooners against An American in Provence. An American in Provence is by Jamie Beck, who is a stunning photographer, and it's a coffee table book, but it still has a really good story to it. It's about how she left behind her crazy New York City life working as a fashion photographer and left it all behind to live in the French countryside for a slower pace of life. The pictures are absolutely stunning, and it's just fun to read someone's story going from the really busy city life to the French countryside. I loved it. And The Unhoneymooners, that one is pretty popular. It's a really sweet romance that's an enemies to lovers. There's no spice in it that I can remember. You know what you're getting with this romance. It's really sweet, really cute, and I really enjoyed it for what it was. And also, my husband gave it to me for my birthday. I think I'm also attaching a little bit of that like romantic sentiment to it as well. This one's a tough one for me because I liked them both for different reasons. And they are so different, like it's like comparing apples to oranges. But I think on this one, I will go with The Unhoneymooners. In full transparency, when I was setting up the list to do this head-to-head tournament, I scrambled all of the books in Excel. And honestly, after it was done, I wanted to redo the list, but I stuck to my principles and didn't redo it. This one makes me laugh. Next we have Dinosaurs Before Dark against Spare. This makes me laugh because I wanted to read the Dinosaurs Before Dark book again just for fun. I was just feeling like reading something that was a kid's book just to kind of get like some new creative energy. And I also wanted to read something short that would up my read count on Goodreads, even though it didn't matter because I didn't reach it anyways. And I had cleaned out some boxes earlier in the year that had all of my YA books in it, and I remembered really liking those when I was younger, so I just reread the first one just for fun. And then obviously we have Spare, which was Prince Harry's book, and I really liked it. I know people had a lot of polarizing opinions on it one way or the other, but I really enjoyed his story, so I'm gonna go with Spare on this one. Should be no surprise. Next is Starring You by Aliza Kelly, who's an astrologer, and Tell Me Everything by Minka Kelly. This is another one that's definitely comparing apples to oranges because the books are just in completely different categories and completely different types of books. And I will admit I bought Starring You without really looking into too much what it was. I just really liked Aliza's content and wanted to learn more about astrology, but it's definitely more of a basic intro book, and it's smaller as well. It's like a very short little informative workbook, but it was definitely at a very basic level, so if I had known more of what it was going into it, I wouldn't have bought it for myself necessarily. But if you are someone that's at that beginner level, like wanting to learn more, it would probably be great for that. So only for that reason I didn't get that value in what I was looking for out of the book, but it was my own fault, so I can't really fault her for that one. Tell Me Everything by Minka Kelly. I loved this book. It was such a good memoir. Not all celebrities like will really go there, and she definitely went there. I loved that one. This one I think is pretty obvious. I'm gonna go with Tell Me Everything by Minka Kelly. I wrote a post about that book. If you want to read more, I'll link it in the comments. Now we have Swipe Up for More and Runaway Groomsmen. Swipe Up for More is about influencer culture. The journalist that wrote it followed around several influencers and just talks about their experiences working as an influencer, and then she also talks about influencer culture as a whole and how it's actually pretty important, and it's more important than we think. Obviously there's different types of influencers. Influencer culture is an interesting and nuanced subject, but I really appreciated her take on it. It was really interesting, and as someone who works in marketing, I appreciated that angle of it as well. I also wrote a post about Swipe Up for More, so I'll link that in the comments, ironically. Runaway Groomsmen, this is the book that made me swear off Megan Quinn books for good. This was the third book that I had read by her, and one of them I really liked. It was the first one I read. Now I don't remember what that one was called, but the other two that I read of hers were just so much fluff. Like the storyline really wasn't moving forward. Just 500 pages of like people wandering around, like I didn't know what was going on. Runaway Groomsmen was the one that did it for me. So no surprise, I'm going to choose Swipe Up for More as the winner. Next we have Remarkably Bright Creatures against The Nanny. This one's another funny matchup for me, but I really loved Remarkably Bright Creatures. I'm realizing that I really like storylines that span like different viewpoints and different timelines, and then at the end you see how they all come together. The Nanny was interesting Felt like the main character was so unhinged. If you just look at the premise of the story and the two main characters, there's no logic or like reason to any of it at all. Especially at the end, like the whole miscommunication trope seems silly, but if you're reading it for what it is, it's enjoyable. You can find enjoyment in it. I didn't loathe it in the same way I loathed Runaway Groomsmen, but yeah, it definitely does not hold a candle to Remarkably Rare Creatures, so that's our winner. Now we have Smuggler's Cove and Love, Pamela. This was one of those that when I was putting together the lineup for the tournament, I actually wanted to reshuffle all of the books and redo the outline. Really loved both of these books, but they're just so completely different. Again, like comparing apples to oranges, can't really like compare to each other in that way. Smuggler's Cove is a coffee table book, and I actually got it for Christmas in 2022, and I remember reading it like all through the Christmas break, which is funny because it's about tiki culture in America and where that started from, who the main proponents of it were. This book is so detailed, it got down to telling you like what shape your ice cube should be that go in all of the different drinks. It's part history, and then it's also part recipe book. It has recipes for all sorts of different drinks. And then funnily enough, we were actually going on our honeymoon in Jamaica a couple months later, so I got to read more about rum culture and rum distilleries in Jamaica, so that was really fun. And then Love, Pamela. I love Pamela Anderson's like meandering poetry type style of writing. I think she's really just vulnerable and like lyrical and honest in the way that she writes and just the way that she like creates. So I really loved reading her book. It just felt like this little like mystical like diary entry of these like romantic points in her life, low points in her life. I really loved this book. Honestly, I don't know which one to pick. I'm not gonna lie. I think because I love Pamela and I really appreciated her deep vulnerability in this book, I think I will go with Love, Pamela. Next we have Big Swiss and Death Valley. Big Swiss was such a weird book, but like the best kind of weird. I feel like you'd just be reading along and then the author like would use the craziest phrases to describe people, and so much of it was just like laugh out loud funny because it caught you so off guard. Really enjoyed her criticisms of the town where the book is set in. It was one that was very weird to read, and parts of it were like tough to read, I guess, in a way, but it was really good. Death Valley, I absolutely loved the cover. When I saw it, I was like, I have to read this. And I think at first I was like wondering where the story was going, but then about halfway through the book when like the main like event happens, that was when I started to get a lot more into it and was like going through it really quickly. I think I appreciated this book a lot more after I was done. It was something that I found myself thinking about it, just thinking about the character, and we're so much in her mind like throughout this whole book, so I was just thinking about like her thought processes and everything she was going through. And this book was also like very meta. Like it was about an author who went to the desert to write a book. The whole thing was like had layers to it in that way. And I appreciated her vulnerability when she was talking about caring for her father. I feel like I liked it more and appreciated it more after I was done with it, which I know sounds weird. I ended up liking both of these books, but I definitely say I liked Big Swiss more. I think it was just a little bit better anyways, so I'm gonna go with Big Swiss. Next is What My Mother and I Don't Talk About and A Year in Provence. This is another one that when I saw it, I wanted to redo my list, but I refused to let myself do that. These books were honestly both so good. What My Mother and I Don't Talk About, I have a blog post written on that, so I will link that one below as well. It was so vulnerable and there were so many different perspectives, and I really think anyone could read it and get something from it. It was just really good. I really liked it. A Year in Provence is a bestseller from the 90s. A couple from the UK go and live in the French countryside, and just the way he criticizes and talks about the culture is just so funny. I loved this book. Like every chapter is a month of the year, so it's literally A Year in Provence. Yeah, really fun, really funny. I loved it. This is another hard one, but honestly I think I'm gonna go with A Year in Provence. Next is Vladimir and I'm Glad My Mom Died. The title is always so confronting when you say it out loud. Both of these books were so good and just heavy in their own way. Vladimir was definitely one of those where you don't necessarily like the main character and there's so much in it that is up for discussion and that you're just thinking about after and that you want to discuss with other people afterwards. I think all of us are familiar with I'm Glad My Mom Died and just everything to do with that story, and I really appreciate when people, especially celebrities, can be really vulnerable about the things that have happened to them in their lives. So this is another tough one for me. They're also so different, so it's hard to compare the two. And it's tough because like I'm Glad My Mom Died was such a good book, and it was so like vulnerable and so well written, but because it was so heavy and because of those reasons, I wouldn't necessarily want to read it again. Whereas Vladimir, I kind of want to read it again because I feel like you might catch like a different perspective the second time around that you read it. Like you just might pick up on new things. So yeah, so it's tough. I'm gonna go with Vladimir on this one. Next is This Is Your Destiny and Black Cake. This Is Your Destiny is another one by Aliza Kelly, and this one was definitely more in depth, more involved, and I also really love the cover. I think it's so beautiful. It's actually one that I bought. I have it sitting on my shelf, and I'll probably go back and read it again. It was a good one. I really liked it. And Black Cake was so good. I loved this one. I actually saw a commercial for it on Hulu, and when it said that it was based on a book, I thought the book sounded really interesting. So I picked that one up from the library, and I loved it. Now they're one of those where you have all these different perspectives and it goes across all of these different generations and time points. So by the end you're realizing like how all of the characters know each other and how they're all in each other's stories. It's like one big mystery that's slowly unraveling. When I first started reading it, the chapters were really short and there were so many different perspectives. At first I was a little bit confused, but once like I got into it and had read a little bit more of it, the story seamlessly flowed. This one was really interesting. There's so much to it. The background of what was going on in Jamaica at the time, and then what was going on in the UK and then the States. Really, really well done. One thing I really liked at the end of the book, she recommended the books that she had read just to learn more about what was going on at the time. So I ended up recording all of those into my Goodreads to want to read later as well. These ones were both really good, but I have to go with Black Cake on this one. Next we have The Woman in Me and Raw Dog. I think we all know The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I actually bought this one the day that it came out as like a little treat to myself. I feel like I never buy books the day that they come out, but this one I was so ready to read. I love that it still was in her voice, like it definitely just sounded like her. I just so appreciated how vulnerable she was in sharing everything with her story. I'll link my post about this book in the comments below too. Just how vulnerable she was, talking about the generational trauma in her family and just everything she had been through in her career, I so appreciated. I think for me, Britney was that girl. Like all of her music videos were just so like, they're so like omnipresent to me, like from my childhood. So I think that was why when the book came out, I'm like, I have to have it because I just had to hear it from her perspective. And then definitely seeing like the arc of how she went from being on top to then being so criticized and just like ridiculed by the tabloids and the media and everything, like to hear it straight from her, I feel like was so important. Raw Dog by Jamie Loftus is so funny. She basically goes on this road trip throughout the United States to all of the best hot dog joints. So she details her experience, but then in between she's also talking about food culture, labor in the States, and hot dog eating contests, and all with her like signature sense of humor. She's so funny, so clever. And I don't even eat hot dogs, like I don't even eat pork, and I still loved reading this book. As much as I love both of these books in their own way, I have to go with The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. Next up, we have The Rachel Incident and Save the Cat Writes a Novel. The Rachel Incident was so good. I loved this book so much. It's one that I still think about. And when I was done reading it, I had to look and see every other book that was written by this author. It's about a young college student living in Cork as she navigates friendships, her first love, crushes on a professor, working in her first job in a bookstore, and a lot more. I honestly would read it again, and I'm not someone that rereads books that often. It was such a good book. I just loved it that much. So the Save the Cat writing style is really popular for writing scripts for movies, and the author adapts that style into books to show you how you can use it to create really engaging stories. And I really loved this one because she used a lot of really thorough examples, so it was really easy to understand everything that she was saying. So it was a really helpful book, and I feel like I got what I needed out of it because that was an area that I felt like I wanted a little bit more help in. But it just doesn't compare to The Rachel Incident at all in that way. They're just completely different books, so I have to go with The Rachel Incident on this one. Next we have My Life in France and City of Girls. My Life in France is by Julia Child. For whatever reason, whenever I try to say Julia Child, I'm also thinking about Julia Stiles, and then I combine them together and sometimes say Julia Childs, which is not accurate. But it's by Julia Child, and it's actually the basis for the movie Julie and Julia, which is one of my favorite comfort watches. And this book details in her own voice her arrival with her husband in France in 1948, and we follow her from being a newlywed and completely unable to cook through to the famous chef that we know today. I really love this book a lot. I love reading books from different times, different generations, because it really shows us that we're not that different from generation to generation as we think we are. This one was a slow read for me. I found myself reading bits of it here and there. It was one that I could pick up and put down and come back to, and I always knew what was going on, always knew where I was, but it really does transport you to Paris, to the French countryside, and just hearing about the process behind her famous cookbooks was really fun too. City of Girls is another really fun one. It's set in 1940s New York City. We follow a rich girl who heads off to New York City, to the big city. She's from a smaller town in New York, and she goes to live with her eccentric aunt at a playhouse, and it's really her coming of age story. And there's a twist at the end because you figure out who the narrator of the book is, and then you figure out some secrets about the main characters as well. I loved both of these, but I'm gonna have to go with My Life in France. Next up, we have Foul Eulogies and Crying in H Mart. Foul Eulogies was such a weird and interesting book. The main character lives in Paris, and she's a vegetarian, and her mother passes away. So she goes back out to the French countryside to take over the family business, which is chicken farming. So she returns to her roots of raising the chickens, caring for the chickens, and slaughtering them. And then we see her journey into helping the chickens self-actualize. And then she ends up having other enemies in her town, and then we see how she handles that, and then where she takes the family business. It was really weird, really interesting, but also funny. And I'm pretty sure this is the book that when I read it on the beach, it's the reason why I sunburned my corneas. And funnily enough, I actually read Crying in H Mart on the beach as well, but I didn't sunburn my corneas that time. Crying in H Mart was a really emotional and heavy read, but it was such a good one. It's about the experiences of a Korean American woman who lives in Eugene, Oregon, and we see her through her childhood and then through to adulthood, and then also caring for her mother as well. Both of these books were really good, but Crying in H Mart was phenomenal, so I have to go with that one. Next we have Financial Feminist and Eligible. I don't remember the reasons why I wanted to read Financial Feminist, but I definitely didn't get much, if anything, out of it. I did not like that one. It was one where it definitely could have just been a long form blog post. It didn't need to be a book, and I feel like the advice that was in it was very basic, so I just didn't really get anything from it. And then Eligible is a Pride and Prejudice retelling. This one was actually really funny, really witty, really enjoyable. I read this one on the plane, which I normally don't read on planes just because I get motion sick really easily, but it was one where I just wanted to keep reading it to see what was going to happen. So I have to go with Eligible on this one. Next up, we have The Guest and Happiness Becomes You. The Guest has been deemed Anxious Girl Summer. It was such a good read. Honestly, don't even really know how to describe this one, but we see the main character. She is out in the Hamptons, and her older rich boyfriend kicks her out of the house, and we see how she navigates the rest of her summer in the Hamptons. I really enjoyed Happiness Becomes You by Tina Turner. I really enjoyed reading the different stories from her life that were sprinkled throughout the book. Although I will say, if you're not in the right place for it, the book might come across as toxic positivity, but depending on where you're at, it was an enjoyable read. But on this one, I have to go with The Guest. Next we have To Die For and Paris Letters. To Die For was a really interesting book. It's all about how the fabrics that our clothes are made with are actually dyed with and dripping with toxic chemicals that are disrupting our hormones and causing all sorts of other issues and autoimmune diseases. But one thing that I really liked about this book that I thought was unique to this category of writing is that it wasn't fear-mongering. The author didn't make it seem like it's all about what the individual is doing wrong. She actually gave us tips for what we can do better as individuals, but also what we can do to advocate for change on a larger scale. So it's definitely about how the chemical companies are able to just make these chemicals without disclosing what's in them and the negative effects that they can have on people. But it wasn't all about how you're making like negative bad choices as a consumer. So that was one thing I really appreciated. It was definitely more from an angle of manufacturers and corporations, what they need to do better. Because some of these informational books can feel more like fear-mongering or like Chicken Little, like the sky is falling, but hers didn't feel like that. In Paris Letters, this book ended up being a really enjoyable read. It was one that I picked up randomly at a used bookstore when I was out on a girls' weekend, and I ended up really loving this book. There were a lot of quotes in it that ended up being like deeply profound and applicable and really enjoyable that I didn't expect. But it's about this woman who quits her job and moves to Paris and meets a guy, and then we see where it goes from there. This is a tough one, but I think I'm actually going to go with To Die For. Next up, we have Black Swans and Waypoints. There's a review for Black Swans on Goodreads that says a book for hot girls about hot girls doing hot girl things, and to me that just sums it up perfectly. It follows the author in the 80s and 90s, and it's just the story of her life, her romances, and the things that she's doing as she lives in Hollywood. I really loved this one. It was one that I actually found myself wanting to read and turning to over wanting to watch TV, and to me that's my barometer for a good book. And last but not least, we have Waypoints, which I actually listened to on audiobook, and it's the first and only audiobook that I've ever listened to for more than like 5 minutes. I actually finished it from start, finished the whole thing, which I've never done before. But we follow Sam Heughan as he hikes the Highland Way, but then in between him talking about his hike and his experience, he's also flashing back to his experiences in Hollywood. This one was really enjoyable. I loved both of these, but I have to go with Black Swans. Okay, round 2, let's go. I have to go with Spare on this one. I really liked both of these books, but it has to be Tell Me Everything. Another tough one, but I really enjoyed the story of Remarkably Bright Creatures. I really liked both of these for different reasons, but I'm gonna go with A Year in Provence. Okay, these are two really great stories, but I absolutely loved Black Cake. I absolutely loved both of these for very different reasons, but the Rachel incident was just phenomenal. Honestly, I'm not sure which one to pick for these two. I loved both of them very differently. They were both such vulnerable stories in different ways, but I think I have to go with Crying in H Mart. I'm honestly not sure which one to pick between these two. Like, one of them made me laugh, the other one made me anxious, but I also loved both of the covers, so I can't even pick one over the other for that reason either. I think I'm going to go with Eligible purely because I enjoyed it more in its own way, whereas The Guest made me super anxious, which was obviously what it was meant to do. Like, that was the point of the book. But it's really hard because they both made me feel something so strongly, but just on different ends of the spectrum. But I think I'll go with Eligible just because for that reason I guess I enjoyed it a little bit more. I thought parts of it were funny, and I also found myself wanting to pick it up again over my phone or the TV. But to be honest, I feel like I could really pick either one for either reason, but I'm going with Eligible. Last one for round 2. I think I will go with Black Swans on this one, just because I love the writing style. It's one that I'd want to read again, even though To Die For was really informative and really important. I think Black Swans is the winner. Okay, round 3, here we go. These were two really good memoirs, but I'm gonna go with Spare. This one's a tough one, but I honestly think I'll go with A Year in Provence. I loved both of these, but I absolutely loved the Rachel incident. I have to go with that one. It has to be Crying in H Mart. Okay, round 4, let's go. I'm gonna go with Spare. It has to be the Rachel incident. Okay, round 5. This one's tough, but I honestly just loved the Rachel incident so much, so I have to go with that one. And then for our final round, we're going to pit the Rachel incident against Black Swans, our little outlier number, because I didn't have the perfect numbers to put together different pools for the tournament, so I had one outlier. And for me, honestly, I have to go with the Rachel incident. I think that's not a surprise. What was your favorite book of 2023? Let me know in the comments.